You're listening to CinePunked. I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson. This episode, elephants. So this episode is something of a CinePunked archival treat. It's a recording of a live panel discussion that we conducted for the Belfast Film Festival way back in 2016. In fact, this is the very first live event that we recorded publicly under the CinePunked name. English director Alan Clarke tended to work on television rather than in cinema, and that meant that for many years his work, with a few exceptions, the likes of Scum, went underappreciated. In the last few years, the BFI and the BBC together have reissued his films to the home video and festival markets, allowing them a previously unthought of reach. In the 1980s, Clarke made 3 films in Northern Ireland: Psychops, Contact and Elephant, all of which are discussed in this episode. Now, Elephant has gained notoriety for its use of Steadicam photography and stark style, depicting over a dozen murders on screen in under 40 minutes. It would go on to influence Gus Van Sant's film of the same name in 2003, itself a reworking of the Columbine massacre in the United States. We explore the production and influence of Clarke's Elephant and the resonances with Van Sant's film.
So welcome to CinePunked. We are... I don't know how to introduce this. I've never thought of this far before. This is the first time we've done this with a name. The last couple of times we've done events, it's been just, hey, we're going to talk about these films. So this is Sin. Welcome to CinePunked. I'm Robert Simpson. I'm the host, and I'm joined today by Conor Smyth. Say hi, Conor.
Hey, how's it going?
And Rachael Kelly.
Hello.
And our very special guest, Belfast Film Festival chair and former BBC employee, Kevin Jackson.
Well, hi there, Robert.
Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Rather excited to have you here because, unlike the rest of us, you worked with Alan Clarke and were involved in the film that's screening on a screen behind us, Elephant, as a locations manager. I think the first thing to start off with this is actually, Conor, you and Rachael are both pretty new to Elephant. How did you find it?
I had heard so much about it, and had an idea of what it was going to be. So I'm not sure how I felt about it the first time I saw it, but it's sort of been in my head all week, playing on this infinite loop, the structure itself just in my head, and I've had a chance to watch it again, and I just find it now so hypnotic and kind of overwhelming and beautiful, which is a strange word to use to describe it. But it's a real masterpiece. I'm glad I got to see it.
I think it's stunning in basically every sense of the word. I think it is stunningly beautiful, aesthetically beautiful. I agree with Conor and when he calls it a beautiful film. And it's strange to call it a beautiful film because it's such difficult watching at times, but just aesthetically speaking, the camera work, the mise en scène, and just the fact that that's all allowed to do all the speaking by itself just creates this incredibly immersive visual experience, but stunning also in the sense that sort of psychologically it's like being smacked on the head. It's really brutal, it's clinical, it's arresting, and just that the portrayal of the violence in that film in such a dispassionate manner is quite stunning to me psychologically when I'm watching it, and you sort of walk away from it. I've watched it a couple of times in the past week. You walk away from it and you kind of go, wow, I haven't seen that done like that before, and I actually can't quite parse that. It takes a while. You kind of have to digest it, and yeah, I agree with Conor. It stayed with me all week. I can't really sort of shake it from my system because it is absolutely haunting and mesmerising.
Yeah, I think the first time you just mentioned it, sort of, he takes time to digest. So it was a little bit shocking just formally at first, and you get your head around it, and you're like figuring out the puzzle. You're like, okay, so this is going to keep happening. Okay, oh no, he's not. But the more it's in your head, and the more you watch it, the more the mood of it kind of affects you, rather than the kind of initial formal kind of idiosyncrasies, I think.
It is quite unlike, I think, almost any other film I've ever seen, and certainly unlike anything else I've seen about the Troubles. It's, for those who haven't seen it and who are listening to this, it's 18 murders in a 38-minute film, and it's basically just the process of each killing, each shooting after shooting after shooting after shooting, all within kind of the general Greater Belfast area. I think I'm right in saying that, Kevin, aren't I? Yes. And it is, I think you're right, it is quite hypnotic. There is something quite beautiful about it. I think every time I look at this now, every killing I see, and that those last frames of the bodies lying there, I'm reminded of Francis Bacon paintings. And just that kind of strange fascination and beauty. And I suppose part of the thing now, looking back at it, is there's all these wonderful Belfast locations that do and don't exist. And it's this little snapshot of the world, a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah, the locations really, really stuck with me in a way I wasn't expecting. I think it may be partly because I've seen Mark Cousins' I Am Belfast recently, and I've been thinking about the idea of what Belfast looks like. And it's partly because it's a little bit dated. It's sort of 1989. So it's kind of a version of Belfast I'm not massively familiar with, just in terms of the structures and the way everything looks. But this deserted kind of urban feel to it, it feels sort of like almost like one of those films where it's in the near future and population's been decimated, and it's just like like a small bandits kind of patrolling the country. It's got it felt like you could say in one sense, the empty locations represent the emptiness of the kind of the people sort of included in it, but it's also the sense for me, there's very little of other people in scenes reacting, and there's very little sense. I mean, we do see cars, and especially in the scene, you walks past different people in the Ormar Baths, so it's a sense of, okay, this is being used and this is alive as a building. But a lot of the scenes don't really have that, and it feels almost like a version of Northern Ireland where the sectarian snake has kind of started to eat itself, and there's kind of nothing left in the city except for these last few murder men. I know that might be a little bit of a strange take on it, but that's really what stuck with me.
It's a Belfast that I recognise. I mean, I'm slightly older, so I do remember Belfast in 1989, and I mean, I do remember sort of the emptiness at times, and the fact that there were times when you just didn't really go out, and it's familiar to me. I mean, obviously it's taken to the extreme, the complete stripping of all emotional response to it, the complete the clinical presentation of the violence is not necessarily something, but obviously that's for effect. But that sense of it sort of being, and I mean, again, you're going back to that idea of the elephant in the room where the title comes from, it being this thing that is going on and that nobody's really acknowledging, because I mean, I do remember that time, and it was just something that kind of faded into the background until it directly impacted you in some way, and even then it wasn't, the overwhelming likelihood was that it was going to be something that kind of tangentially impacted you. It wasn't necessarily going to be something that had a major impact in the sort of the continuation of your life. So that sense of it's just happening, it's just going on, and everybody's kind of ignoring it, and as much as they can. I mean, that felt very recognisable to me watching it.
I think it's a good point at which to get Kevin involved, because I'm interested in kind of your impressions of it as a film, because I mean, you're someone who's worked a lot with different films anyway, so, and then to talk about the locations, because you were locations manager on this.
Well, the impression we had initially, because we were used to working within a reasonably rigorous television structure, which was a script arrived, you blocked it out in rehearsal, you scheduled it, you went out and you shot the script. And the actors who were brought on board were loosely directed by whoever was in charge, and at that time it was Danny Boyle. I had been in theatre up until the year before, and Danny had only just joined the BBC a year and a bit before Elephant had been made, and had made and directed 3 films and produced another film. So this was the second time that he was working actually as a producer with a separate director. And so we'd got used to Danny just going off and doing whatever he wanted to do, and they were different types of stories, but they were very much narrative tales. And in introducing us to Alan Clarke, who, after all, had since the late 60s been working in television and creating quite a lot of studio plays as well as some location pieces, was a terribly experienced television director. And yet the whole feeling about the making of this film was a collaboration that I then became used to in later days, where film was made on the day and then later in the cutting room. It wasn't something, because there was no dialogue, you weren't quite sure of the structure that was going to then be delivered to the audience, that for all of us it was a little confusing. But because he was such an engaging character, what we ended up with was a man standing in front of us at the beginning of a morning and then a second time in the afternoon, discussing where we were, talking to an armourer about a particular weapon, looking at the cast he had in front of him, who were only there for that half a day, and talking to costume makeup, asking people questions, how they might feel a murder. There were 2 policemen with us at all time, one because of the armoury that we had, and one who was a police liaison officer. And they were included because they had considerable knowledge of murder scenes. And it was a process that allowed him to then get into his head exactly how he would like to finish something. The beginning of it he already knew. He knew he was going to start. He knew the people he was going to ask to take part in those shots. But the end of it for him was, how would you kill somebody with this weapon? And then he allowed himself to have the freedom to put the actors into that position and then just work it. And so we would spend maybe 5.5 hours shooting one particular sequence, but the first 3.5 hours was discussion. And that's the difference. Working with the man was about making a film, even though it was going to end up on television. Everything before and for a number of years after that was all about how do we create the opportunity to get enough scenes done in a day that we can feel as though by the end of the shoot we will have shot the script. When you start with no script, it could start and finish at any time. And as it did in this case, we had 2 6-day weeks. So that was 12 days in which we were going to kill 24 people. And when it came to Saturday, the final Saturday, it got to lunchtime, and Alan said, I think I've done enough. So he gave us the afternoon off, and we never killed the last person. So there it is, bleak though it might be, there was a happy ending for one person.
So how far ahead of this did you start looking around at the locations, and how do you go about that process of picking them? Because, I mean, it's one of those strange things that is this Belfast that isn't there today, but there are very definitely identifiable landmarks within that. There are places that I know. And so I'm curious, I mean, obviously there's a few that are quite close to the BBC, but you do go further away as well. So can you talk to us about that process?
I will, but I'm going to preface that by saying that this isn't the film we were going to make.
This wasn't the film you were going to make?
No.
So what was?
It was a piece that was to be about RUC suicide. Now, I'm not sure whether it was the same writers, but a few years later that was made, produced by Robert Cooper, and it was called Force of Duty. And it was written by Chris Ryder and Bill Morrison being a contemporary of Alan Bleasdale and Willie Russell. And Chris, who is a local journalist, and he's also an author. And we were told that's the film that Alan was going to come and shoot. And so that's what we were expecting. And when Alan arrived and Danny introduced us, there's a small group of people working in the production office, the line producer, myself as location manager, one of the production assistant, and the first AD. We were introduced to Alan and then told we're not doing that film. Television terms, you book a crew in advance. This is not an independent film. So you have a slot that is when the crew is available, and that was coming up fast. So it was a 3-week filming slot that we had booked a crew for, and we were 5 weeks away from that, and we hadn't got an idea what we were going to do with them. So Alan spent a week talking to Danny, and I believe that Danny and he came up with this idea, which was going to be a landscape of brutality, and yet it was not yet fleshed out. So there was one morning, Alan came from the Europa, a bit of branding here, and he wandered across to us in the office, and he said, I've got something for you. And he pulled out a sheet of paper. He said, I've been working on this last night. I'm going to read it out to you, and I want you guys to tell me what you think. Now, that's the production office. It's not just talking to the producer. It's us, the guys who are supposed to help facilitate what he is going to do as a creative. And it started like this. A walks along the street. We follow him. A meets B. A and B walk along the street together. B kills A. B moves on, walks around the corner down the street, meets C. B and C walk down the road together for a bit of a distance, and C kills B. C continues on the journey and meets D. Are you getting where I'm going with this? And we go, yeah. And said, and how long will this happen? Will be any? No, this is just a continuous chain of events. And so the question was, how does it end? And he said, I've no fucking idea. But I think what we'll do is we'll just shoot the rap party. Everybody, all the victims and all the killers will be there, and it'll just be kind of like a party. And so it was not really properly fleshed out. And the question was, what do you think? And we go, that's interesting, Alan. But I don't like it. What do you think? And he goes, you know what? It's actually pretty shit, isn't it? I'm going to go away again. Next day he came back and he brought Elephant.
Wow.
And that was possibly Alan playing a trick on us, or possibly it was something which was just a test to see how we would respond to what was going to be remorseless scene after scene of death.
Yeah.
Possibly, but he never would explain that. He was the most engaging and charming man. So the next day he came back with Elephant, and that Danny wanted to make. That was the film he wanted to make. And it was inevitably still going to be about long walks, that required geography, landscape, barrenness was one of the words, bleak, and then he wanted a place where it would be appropriate for somebody to be found, either in a workplace or in a domestic situation or in a casual environment, wherever it might be. It was somewhere that was perhaps safe, and then somebody would die. So the investigation for locations was the brief, basically, wherever there we can find an urban or domestic situation that is got some kind of geography and some kind of world around it that would look ordinary, extremely ordinary, but be vacant as well, was what we had to seek. And because time was marching on, we also had to seek it quite quickly. And so we got into a car, and we started touring Belfast. And I immediately took him to the closest locations, which, as you said, some are close to the BBC. There was an old factory that was there, which we used to use as rehearsal rooms for drama. And we went in there, and he loved the building, he loved the exterior, he loved the space, and it is one of the early deaths in the film. Straight across to Ormer Baths, because I knew it was a wonderful Victorian building, and it gave you lots of cinematic opportunities. But also the approach to it was very interesting, because Belfast is low-rise, and so you can look at a very long street, and I knew that he was interested in streets. We watched Christine and Road before, and we've seen him working in Contact, where he's interested in wide spaces and emptiness. And so that was inevitably a long walk that you could make to a building, and then within the building, lots of turns, etc. And it was clear at this stage, because he'd said it was going to be his last film made on Steadicam, that he was going to shoot this in one take and then do a bit of coverage towards the end. So we spent morning and afternoon, and usually 2 or 3 times in the morning or 2 or 3 times in the afternoon we'd stop at a burger bar, because Alan ate hamburgers all the time. It was a passion of his, because he's a man who used to have other things in his life that would drive him on, and now he turned to a food junkie. And we just followed a course, if you like. I took him to South Belfast, Rosetta area, where we found a taxi area, a taxi rank, and a nice office upstairs. And we found a wasteland with a little building site. We showed him, I suppose, over the period of 2 weeks, maybe 80 or 90 different places. And every time he would get out of the car and we'd walk around, and he'd put his hand up like he was the camera lens on a Steadicam unit. and he'd walk to where the murder would take place, and he'd finish off by saying, "Yeah, I could kill someone here." And it was just a matter of it became, well, that's what we're going to do. We could do 80 of them, we could do 30, however many. And it was simply a matter at that stage of choosing what were the most cinematic locations for him, whether it be a factory building or the playing field outside or a street that had an alleyway through to the back of a house or going directly to the front of the house down somebody's pavement. Daytime and nighttime, that was terribly important too, because we knew we were going to be filming when we could only shoot in the daytime for half the day, and therefore we were going to have either an exterior nighttime sequence, which can take a little bit of time to set up with lighting, especially if you're Steadicam, or you're going to use available light, which meant that it needed to have quite a considerable amount of available light, or you were going to go for an interior. And he was then in a position from the Polaroids and from his memory to choose and select and allow us to then go and get secure permissions. The process was the most fun. It wasn't you got, I think, like the film itself, we as a team were worried about this repetitive nature of brutal killings, but whenever you were actually going out looking for a place to kill people, it just became, well, that's what we do, that's what this film is going to be. And you began to feel as though there was an anesthetic quality to this horror that he was going to embark upon, and it just became a practical experience.
It's quite a curious observation, I suppose, in some respects, because it is, you talk about this sort of antiseptic quality, and there is something kind of numbing about the film after a while. You know, you watch it and you see someone die, and at first you kind of care, you think that it's going to go somewhere, and as time goes on, you gradually stop caring about why. You're just kind of curious to see where and how quickly.
However, I actually think, yes, that was my experience on watching it, but I actually think the final killing in it is probably the one that I find most unbearable to watch. That's the bit where I actually, the first time I saw it, I wasn't aware, obviously, that it was going to become quite so difficult for me to watch. But yeah, that's the bit that actually jolts me right back out of it again, because it's just the way he walks in. He walks in so calmly, and you assume that he's one of the killers. Right up to the bit where they put him against a wall and put a bullet in his brain, and I find that really, really difficult to watch because it's so stripped of emotion, because he's just literally walking in there like a robot and standing in front of a wall and dying. So yeah, I have to say, yeah, I agree with you, but that's part of the power of it as well, though, isn't it? The fact that it does kind of numb you to the sort of repeated killings. But yeah, then that last one, I don't know whether anybody else experienced it in that way. I mean, that bit for me was the bit where it actually shocked me straight back out of it, and actually made me feel almost sick, because I find it so
it does throw
unbearable.
you, that one. I mean, because there is a shift, because as you say, he is so casual as he walks in there. He seems quite confident. They seem like they're friends, and maybe they are, and maybe this is the thing. But he just takes that moment, just in hand, and you know, there's no protestation about
Nothing.
it. He clearly knows what's happening.
Yeah. There's nothing, without even a whimper, without even a blink of the eye, he just stands in front of the wall and dies. Which I just find really much more difficult to watch than even the guys that are running away, because there's something you can identify with in that. There's something, you know, that's human, that's recognisable, but this is just completely, it's so stripped that it's just so difficult to watch, knowing that it's going to happen. So yeah, incredibly powerful way to end it, because I'm actually physically sick by the end of it, because it is just that difficult to watch.
Interestingly, of all of them, because as I say, it had been a terribly collaborative process, when he rehearsed that, we had been filming for a number of days, and this was in the Rothmans factory, which is in the old Rothmans factory at Carrickfergus, which is a wonderful, huge building. It no longer exists. It's now a PSNI training centre, and had become an RUC training centre, but it was completely empty. And as you can see from, we used it a lot. We used the corridors a lot. We killed somebody in the toilets. We killed somebody walking across the whole of those floors, or as you say, the final one. We used the playing field was there as well, the football field outside. And that was the one which was so different, as you rightly say. There was some discussion about disbelief you asking us to actually take on board, because we were sucked into the process of being able to be critical about how Alan was going to stage things, because he required it of us. But I'm not saying that was a discussion that was broad. It was just, I think he's got this one wrong. This won't work. And it just was because it felt sort of like this complicity between the killer and the victim was something which just didn't chime with everything else we'd done, because the victims were unaware until the very last minute that they were to become victims.
Yeah, it's actually for me the impact of it is kind of devastating. I completely. It does. That's why it's so shocking, is that it is so completely. It's a film that's completely stripped of emotion and context and response and cause and effect in general. But that actually taking it to that extreme, I think really, really powerful.
But without a script, and therefore not knowing where Alan was going to finish his film, and because we shot 23 of these, and there are 18 in the finished piece, that could have been in his mind that was always going to be the way he would like to finish off. But whenever he would have taken it into the cutting room, and he and Danny would have talked about it, and Don O'Donovan, sadly no longer with us either, who cut it, was a staff editor who didn't do an awful lot of drama, but he did an awful lot of news and documentary, and therefore would have been somebody who had a very strong eye for this type of material. I wouldn't have been at all surprised if they felt, well, that is so different. That is the one we're going to use last, and not necessarily that it was Alan's initial plan.
I think you start to care because there's a narrative that you read in with the two people as well, because they do seem like they're okay with each other. There's a journey that they're taking together, and there's a third man, and you do kind of instantly assume they're bumping him off. And he's waiting for them, but it does play out with those expectations, but you start to care. And I don't think you really do care properly until that point. And that's part of the thing, I think, is that you do get numb to it, you do start to accept it. But I also get the impression that was my vague recollections at the time. I was only a child, but we kind of had got numbed in this country to what was happening. We kind of just accepted that there's another report in the news tonight, somebody else has been shot. And this film, unlike anything else, does it very well. It doesn't tell you if these are nationalists or loyalists. You've no idea what they are. It doesn't matter. They're just murderers, because that's what Northern Ireland was full of at the time, at least if you read the news reports.
But he'd done that before. He did go through phases. They were incredibly intelligent, very smart, very politicized man. But Christine had been made just a couple of years before, and had been transmitted in, I think, 87, following on from Road, I think, at the same time. Those two films where he was using the Steadicam technique considerably. Christine was, again, this journey of a young girl going through a very ordinary estate with a plastic bag, visiting her friends' houses, going into kitchens where mums might be and the television was on with children's television, and delivering Class A drugs. And you'd see them shooting up, and they wouldn't see them shooting up, they would actually just take delivery of them. But you did follow this girl in a relentless way through a very ordinary set of circumstances without there being a commentary on this is good, this is bad. In fact, the treatment of it was just like delivering a bag of sweeties. And even right at the end, we just finished with the girl just sitting there, whacked out on a bench. He had got into his head this sense of people allow shocking things to occur in the most ordinary of circumstances, because either they don't want to see it or they want to stay away from it, but it does happen. And this was an incredibly extreme version of it by shooting Elephant, as opposed to Christine, which was something which, again, you could consider was really boring until you realized, actually, that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think the ordinariness of Elephant is part of what gives it a sense of violation of these things happening in these spaces, and people entering sort of other people's homes or places of business, or just sort of general cafes, places where people would just go day to day. The places in the film aren't, or don't seem to be, marked as particularly sectarian or particularly related to kind of criminality in any way. And that's part of the why it kind of gets under your skin, the sense of the absence of safety.
Also, I think because the title, and I can't tell you how they came up with the title, regardless of the attributed sort of Bernard Clafferty sort of elephant in the room. However, if you consider that you were observing this, it's almost as like the world is behind the camera lens. In front of the camera lens, there is just a victim and a killer. And so the empty space, the sort of negative space that he creates in almost every single one of the killings, apart from something like the football field, or as you said, very early on when they're walking around the Ormeau Baths, gives you a sense that this could still be a populated room or a populated house or a populated street. It's just these are the people who don't want to know. These are the people who let this happen all through their daily lives, but they just want it to be somebody else who's going to be the victim and not them. And they will not want to recognize the killer, which is why I think quite a lot of it, the camera behind, where we're following a killer to some destination, is again a sense that we can see it happening, but we don't want to be involved.
I actually find the football sequence the weakest in the film. I think there's just that's where there's the only dialogue really. There's just a couple of lines that, and again, it just seems to sit out against everything else, and I don't know what to make of it, but it just falls flat for me every time I watch it.
I think part of it is the distance as well. He's got a very big wide shot there. And usually what we're doing is we're following somebody, or somebody walks into frame and then we go with them. And there he starts with a wide, and we see all of this activity which goes on for quite some time before one of the characters, is Paddy Rocks, walks into frame and then delivers a line of dialogue to somebody who's still kicking the ball around. He passes the ball back to him, and then there is a chase, a very brief chase, and everybody else runs off. Quite right, he's a very different style, but I think it starts off visually in a way which jars with the rest of the work that he does in the film.
It's quite disturbing though when you think about that, because it's almost like we actually want to be right up there with the killer for it to have its effect. Whenever we're removed, we stop. Our interest is lost. Our kind of.
Well, for me, I think, I do tend to agree with you that it sticks out for me. I'm not sure I would necessarily have called it the weakest section. I mean, there's a couple of them which I find a bit more kind of, not forgettable, that's the wrong word, but they don't quite stand out as much. But I think for that one, for me, it's the one that kind of most closely references other work that's been done on the Troubles, just purely because it's a format that we can recognise. It is slightly narrativized to that extent, and we have at least some kind of human anchor there in a way that we don't necessarily have with the other ones. So for me, that is probably the one where this actual human reaction where he screams shit and runs for it. That's much more like other narrative work I've seen about the Troubles. So I can sort of see where you're coming from here. It does kind of it kind of separates it from the others in the sense that the others just give you no opportunity to kind of experience that level of human connection, maybe.
Well, we've all seen, I mean, the film festival this week has screened Psy Warriors and Contact as well. Have we all seen all of those? Mm-hmm. Kevin, you have, I'm sure.
I have seen Contact. Funnily enough, I saw Psy Warriors when it first came out, and I haven't seen it since, and so I didn't watch it this festival. Okay,
well, I think we've all seen Contact now. Contact's kind of interesting as well in that sort of in that sort of removal, I think, of explanation about things at times. It seems to sort of distance itself. It tries to look a little bit more objectively, I think, at what's happening in Northern Ireland, even though it's very clearly the focus is very much on the British Army rather than sort of the Republicans or up in bandit country.
Well, there's it's in common with Elephant. There's no hand holding with Contact. It's just presented. This is what's happening. Keep up or don't. Sort of impose your own narrative on it, or kind of keep up with what you're being presented with, or don't. We're just going to present this to you in a way that kind of makes it visceral, makes it real, makes it almost experiential. Because you're forced into that situation. If they don't know what's going on, You don't know what's going on. They've only got very limited information, and yeah, it's psychologically very difficult to kind of to be in that position. I did find Contact hard to follow at places, and I think that's part, for me, of the success of it. I don't know, and this is not a very well formed thought, but for me, the experience of watching Contact, I felt like it was a better Troubles film than Elephant, although Elephant to me is by far the superior film. And I don't know, I mean, working through my thoughts on that, I think it's because of the perspective of the narrative, effectively, and this perspective of who's telling the narrative. And I tend to have a little bit... the success of Elephant, for me, is that it never attempts to simplify anything. It decontextualizes the murders, but it doesn't try and narrativize them in a way that makes you pick a side. It's presented to you completely stripped of any kind of context, any kind of narrative. It's just murders are happening and they are being allowed to happen, and that's the power of it. But for me, it's also, to a certain extent, a weakness to it, because it is not a situation that can be simplified like that. I mean, there is no way of understanding the situation without that contextualizing narrative. However, it's also, conversely, the power of it. So it's kind of a loop for me that I can't quite get myself out of. With Contact, it's the position is of somebody who is not of the area where they're being placed into an area, a hostile area, which they don't understand, and that feels like a more natural position for Clarke as a filmmaker to take on Northern Ireland, which is not to say, obviously, that somebody who's not from Northern Ireland can tell stories about Northern Ireland. I think in many ways, it escapes the kind of sort of pained navel gazing that goes on when people from here try to tell the story. So it's so terribly complicated you couldn't possibly understand. But it also brings in that element of the tourist gaze, I suppose, which is unavoidable, whereas the tourist gaze in Contact works incredibly well.
There's lots of nice scenery in that.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, in terms of the aesthetics, yes, but also in terms of the narrative positioning. But yeah, it's one of those films. I mean, I find it powerful watching, but again, the power for me comes from the fact that it completely refuses to lead you. You're forced to make your own narrative and draw your own conclusions from it, which is it's a very brave piece of filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously different levels of similarities between Elephant and Contact. I think Elephant is, like you say, sort of superior. Mostly because, like you said, Contact has a bit more narrative character stuff going on, but the experience of the platoon commander in Contact kind of felt like me. What would happen to a person, or what would their state of mind be if they had to go through like all of the sequences in Elephant? Because everything in Elephant is sort of segmented, but in Contact it has a similar level of kind of repetition and the numbing ordinariness, like interspersed with kind of horrible violence. These scenes when he's explaining the mission and they're all kind of just sitting there in this like slightly run down room, and they all kind of look bored, and they go out there and it's the same thing, someone else gets blown up, and then he goes back, and then they go back out again, it's the same thing, and someone else dies, and he has to go through that, and it feels like whereas Elephant was sort of like giving you a look at the pathology of the people who do the killing, that kind of numb, robotic soldier kind ofness. In some ways, Contact was kind of like the psychology of the people who have to live through the killings in a way.
I would speak up for Alan here a little bit to say that he came to Northern Ireland to make Elephant, and Danny very much wanted him to make it, and the BBC felt that it was strong enough to be made. But the mistake is that he didn't come to Belfast to make a film about the Troubles. He came to make that film, which is about how easy it is if you make the choice to kill somebody to go ahead and do it in any environment. And this was not a story which was about what had gone on for so many years at that stage, nearly 20 years at that stage, in Northern Ireland. The fact is that it wasn't. He had made films about Northern Ireland in the past that weren't made here, or had Northern Irish issues associated with them. So it's very easy to be able to say that Elephant is about Northern Ireland, but he clearly does not show you Northern Ireland. He shows you streets and architecture, and he puts people into contemporary costume, and he puts handguns and shotguns into their hands. But what he doesn't do is declare where we are. Contact, and I think this is what I think to add to what Conor is saying, the fact is that what we have is a lot of anonymous people who can blend into a crowd, and all they have to do is carry a lethal weapon and step up next to somebody and shoot them dead. A soldier on a patrol in a place where the whole world is upside down and killing is taking place by these very anonymous people is wearing a target on the back because they're wearing a uniform. They're travelling around in vehicles that are identifiable. They are all at risk. They're heavily armed, and they may well have their own violent tendencies, but they are standing in front of potential killers on every day, and they're putting themselves into danger is the most obvious target. So I think Clarke was probably very clear that what we're looking at there in that film that preceded Elephant was a group of people who were putting themselves in harm's way because they were required to.
It's interesting actually reading some responses from people who watched Elephant without any contextualizing information at all, and yeah, it's very clear that kind of universality of the message is, yeah, it is a very powerful message that can be read completely divorced from any sense of the troubles as being the narrative behind it. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, I don't want to preempt Robert, but I suppose that's why Van Sant was able to kind of use it as the motivating or the sort of the primary source for his take on violence and violence that exists within and around us, almost invisibly.
We'll get into Van Sant's Elephant in a couple of minutes.
Sorry.
No, you're quite right. 'Cause, I mean, the thought's there, and there's natural kind of things, but I do want to kind of also mention Psy Warriors because, you know, it's the other one of Clarke's films that is ostensibly about Ulster because it mentions Ulster several times, and then it's got Colin Blakely as a soldier. Colin Blakely's a Bangor man originally, and a great actor in it. And Psy Warriors is interesting because actually it feels more like he's placing a judgment in that film on the way that the process worked. It's about the British Army and their psychological warfare techniques. This was happening at the same time in Northern Ireland with sort of internment and things, and there's some sort of relation to that and the way that they get their confessions out of people and that information. And as we were talking before this, and I completely missed this point, this was broadcast at the same time that the hunger strikes were going on.
Yes, to the extent that it was the very day that Francis Hughes died, and that it was broadcast, and only a week earlier Bobby Sands had died. And nonetheless, they did broadcast it, which is possibly a brave thing to do, but because it was not directly about Northern Ireland, but yet it was, as you say, after internment and with so much complexity taking place. The timing of the broadcast was quite extraordinary. But also, I have to say, I'm just going to look at Alan Clarke's use of work. That it's a studio piece. And it's a beautiful studio piece. It's minimalist, and it's got a considerable quantity of depth to it. They strip everything out of the studio. And at that time, the BBC, and indeed before them, ITV and Rediffusion, etc., were concentrating on studio drama. And there was a deliberate movement at that time to retain studio drama as being the core drama that the BBC did, their playhouses and their theatres and whatever it might be. So there was a lot of adaptation of novelists and theatre pieces that were going into studio. And it was at the time when the movement was going to be, like Channel 4 coming along, taking things outside onto location. But there was a determined effort to try to use the studio space in a much more artistic and creative way. And Alan was one of those great people at stripping something back and just putting things in there that were going to be actors and performers, and you've got these cages, if you like, and you look at these images. He could work in the exterior world very beautifully, but whenever he was in a studio, he could also create what was an artistic and creative space for the performance to take place in and for the camera to enjoy that experience.
I mean, it's beautifully shot the way that he uses the camera with that. He's not afraid to have barriers between the actors and the camera lens. So you've got these bars of the cages going down, and you kind of look and you can't even see the eyes because the bars are just in shot. And what it ends up giving it is this sort of a quality of a scientific experiment. You know, it's like those old graphs you see in old books where you've got the grids and the models are in front of them, and that's what it is. It emphasises that science element, I think.
Lab rats.
You've watched this week, haven't you?
Yes.
Yes.
Don't worry.
I doubt myself there for a second.
Yeah, I think it seems more obviously studio than the other ones. Clearly, when you sort of look at all three together, you're right about the science kind of lab quality to it, which I didn't really think about it. It does have a science fiction, like futuristic kind of feel to it, all that white. I think that one of the things that it shares with other films is a sense of altered reality, of the pressure of being a person in this strange reality that's been kind of created by conflict or created by the kind of whatever scenarios that are political and religious that are happening at the moment. So it's the characters are placed in these environments where they can't really be proper people, and you see in Side Warriors, the more it goes on, the more you realise, you think that they're just prisoners, they're actual people who are suspected of having committed some sort of crime, and it goes on, you realise that they're actually taking part in a kind of experiment. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it in comparison with the last scene in Elephant. In Elephant, what we talked about, the victim and the aggressor kind of walk together, and it's almost a sense that the victim is really complicit, and they're both locked into this weird psychology or weird cycle that is taken over both. And in Side Warriors, you see, oh no, yeah, this is horrible, but people signed up for it. It's this kind of machine that creates monsters, and there's that speech at the end of Side Warriors by the candidate who's been kind of groomed to head a basically assassination squad, black ops sort of thing. And he has that speech at the end where he talks about how he's been changed, but the military psychologist who's in charge of it, he hasn't been changed. So it's almost like these scenarios create these awful cultures that in turn reproduce inhuman sort of tendencies. And I know at the end of Side Wars he has the speech and he sort of rejects it, which felt, I think he's supposed to be rejecting it. He throws his hat down.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that he's joining the army at that point. I think that's him kind of walking off to raise bees.
Felt a little bit fake, but it felt a wee bit artificial, a little bit stagey or something, because these people do exist and they don't always hand in their nose at the end of these things.
But I think you've got other characters in that. I mean, there's the woman who's kind of in there who ends up kind of liberally getting on board with Mein Kampf. Oh, she's feeling really enthusiastic. Like, that's great, I'm going to remember that quote, I'm going to do things. Quote. That's Hitler.
That's going to my fridge.
I think what I find interesting about those films, about all three of the films, is that this is a British filmmaker who's making films that are in some way seen as Troubles films. And I don't think they're entirely sympathetic to the British end of things, but they're not exactly kind of... They're not playing into that typical trope of Troubles films, which seems to me to be a kind of Republican struggle story. That's always the underdog. It doesn't feel that that's quite what these are doing, and it feels that there's a slight bit of judgment and questioning about the process. And I think the narrative that we're told in this country often sort of assumes that the British is purely an invading force, and there's no questioning about that. Now, that's maybe interesting to kind of see how you respond to that. I'm worried about getting political now, but
yeah, I'm worried about getting political now. Again, I'm going to just, difficult for me to answer that. I
That's
suppose
fine.
difficult
If you
for
don't have
any.
an answer.
No, I suppose difficult for any of us to answer it as people who have been raised here.
Yeah.
And we can't sort of step outside of that identity. Again, I'm just going to refer back to all the reading I've been doing around it and different people's responses to the film. People who have been, a lot of American responses to it, and people who have not necessarily come to it with contextual knowledge, and have been quite, oh God, that was Belfast, was it? Okay, fine. And their response then has been to assume that it's IRA killings, specifically IRA, and they don't have necessarily any other contextualizing information there to suggest that it might actually be, there were two sides doing killings in Northern Ireland. So, yeah,
But that's
I don't know
interesting because I think that must fall into the tropes that are kind of peddled on the Northern Irish story.
Yeah.
Is that it's the IRAs the ones that are kind of raising up with the guns, and it's the British Army that are coming in and kind of shooting them down.
So
whereas actually we know it's more complex.
So if
than
there's
that.
not a uniform on the person doing the killing, then it must be IRA. Is kind of, again, I suppose that gets me back to that sort of idea of that very simplistic narrative that gets recycled, and I suppose. Going back to what Kevin said, it's a stronger film when it's not a Troubles film. If you watch it as not being a Troubles film, you get a much stronger message from it. And when these people are watching it as a film that does not necessarily have that context around it, they're getting this very anti-violence message. When they watch it as a film that is about the Troubles, then they are simplifying the message to an extraordinary extent, which very interesting, actually. What does that say? I don't know. I don't know. I haven't fully formed a thought on that.
I think I've fallen into the same trap that I suppose a lot of people do, is that I read it as a Troubles film because I know it was shot here, it was made here, and because everyone refers to it as a Troubles film, and because there's a couple of wee Northern Irish accents in there. If they didn't speak, I would not necessarily see it as a Troubles film, but they instantly kind of
the
put
Troubles
that here.
Archive has claimed that it's a Troubles film as well, so
there you go.
But
it's those
kind of
accents,
irrevocably now associated with it.
Those voices make it about here.
Yeah.
Whereas otherwise you do have a film that's about gun crime, I suppose, which
I
Not
know
even about gun crime, it's about violence.
Violence, it is. It's not. Yes, it's not just gun crime. Yes, if it had been shot in Colombia with Colombian actors, it would have been about drugs, and we would never have seen a single drug. But that would have been it. It would have been drug lords. That's obviously what it is. It's corruption, and Elephant doesn't smack of corruption. But if you put it into a different context and you reshot the film in a different cultural background, you would start thinking of it in a different way, and you would label it in a different way. And because the filmmaker hasn't labelled it, we are making an assumption, and that assumption is based upon our knowledge of where it was made. And therefore, quite interestingly, people who are coming to it who suddenly are told it's Belfast are assuming, oh, IRA. It's kind of, no, there's no statement of that. So it's an interesting judgment of the humans that are watching it as to how they associate with the history of this place and the violence that has taken place here. Alan was very much an anti-Thatcher person, and as many writers and creatives were. In fact, quite a lot of people, except those who voted for Thatcher, were anti-Thatcher. And he went, because that was a fairly long period of time that she was in control of the country and in charge of the politics, he was in a position where, within an institution like the BBC or employed by the BBC, continuing to make a great body of work, a lot of it about institutions, a lot about his take on how institutions can form opinions and can create monsters, even though some of those people are really quite extraordinary, talented individuals themselves. It's the pressure of the outside world, the pressure of the controlling influences that Britain had over people at the time. And I would have to say that that's probably part of the makeup of Psy Warrior's Contact, Elephant, in that this is the world we live in because we've allowed it to become this. And I think, without becoming political about Northern Ireland, I think his own social politics were about observing things which were wrong, telling stories with other writers about things which needed attention. And yes, they were put into fictional environments, but mostly these were very bright, very conscientious people who were angry. And whilst I never saw Alan angry, you can quite imagine that in the back of his mind there were things that he always wanted to make stories out of, to create an opportunity for people to have a debate afterwards, which would bring up the very subjects that he had felt so strongly about.
What's interesting to me, even just from this discussion, is the absolute necessity we have to narrativize violence, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, I'm coming into this with the assumption it's the troubles. I have to put a cause and effect to the violence, even though there is deliberately no cause and effect shown on the screen, and that's actually key to the presentation of the film. I come to this as a viewer, and I have to put cause and effect around that. And everybody else, as I've spoken to or sort of read their response to the film, they have to put cause and effect around it. And you're saying, Kevin, if you set it in Colombia, it becomes about the drugs war in Colombia. Just that. We need to kind of put that. We need to kind of say, well, this is why it happened. I suppose that's that impulse towards safety. You know, if we understand why, if we have a definite reason why, then we can be safe. We can avoid the why and not become the person that's murdered. Which is very. I don't know.
Even though like both elephants are very consciously about. Don't narrativize. Like this is just the thing that's
very
happening.
Specifically,
you know, like I read somewhere. Just in a blurb or description before I watched this that said it was about Republican internal feuds, internal killings. So that was just in my head when I was watching it, and I really wish I'd never read that. Yeah. Like I want to show it to someone and not tell them anything. Just like look at this.
No, that was Michael Winterbottom's film. That was the Precious Blood. That was all about that.
I mean, we do talk about how. I mean, certainly. Leading up to the peace process, there's often talk about how violence is senseless. So senseless violence is really what that is. So even in a Troubles context, it is the senselessness of it. But you're quite right. I mean, this is a film that's actually about violence. It's not necessarily Troubles. Although I cannot, even saying that, shift the idea of this is about the Troubles from my head.
Yes.
But I mean, it does bring us. Let's bring us back into the discussion of the other elephant, which is Gus Van Sant's, which we now. All the reading you do about it isn't about gun crimes in school necessarily. It's a response to Columbine, which was kind of which again we kind of know. It's a story that we know, we think we know, and it's about the randomness of the outsiders coming in amongst their peers and gunning them all down. What do we feel about Gus Van Sant's Elephant?
I'm not a fan, but I do admire his works. I find it a really a mixture because we are allowed to interact with the individuals who have a life, but it is a school life, and they're involved on their rounds, having their social intercourse, doing their little bits of activity, whether it be going to the library, whether it be sports, whether it be photography. Our young man who we introduced to at the beginning of the film is introduced to through a moment of comedy, and he is a survivor because his dad's drunk and taking him to work, and he's smashing the side of the car against other parked cars as he's driving to school. It's an interesting way of introducing a film which is all about a vicious-minded monster and his henchmen wandering through to the school to have fun, which is basically what he says, remember to have fun. And because it introduces a sense to me, not of normality, but of abnormality, that this is a damaged place. And the only damage that I can see that really is there is with one or two of the individuals. Okay, well, no, I'm wrong. And actually, there's damage all the way through it, because it's his drunken father, it's the bulimic girls, it's the the bullied sports person, the photographer who only has one thing in his life, and that's taking photographs, and doesn't seem to have. He has friends, but he just needs to take. There are a lot of individuals that we get to recognise as, and I suppose because they are considered to be odd, and he is representing them as the norm, and the oddest of them are the two killers, and I'm not sure what he's saying there. Is it that the society that in schools are all a bit crazy, or are we particularly picking on the weaker points and then saying these are the ones who get killed? because actually, although there's the principal is shot brutally, it's again a sense that he's introducing us to people that we either would not like to have as our friends, and allowing the blonde nice guy to be, a survivor, because he doesn't really show any weakness. He's just a dude, but he has a life where his dad's the difficult person, and he has to cope with that. So in some ways, what it left me with the impression that crazy bad guys actually kill the weaklings. It's like crocodiles and at the waterhole. I'm not quite sure about the film, because it is brutal, and particularly in the last act, it really did affect me. But I just wasn't sure about the characters in it.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I think for me, it's a film that is trying to say, well, there's no point in looking for answers to these questions, while still desperately looking for answers to these questions. It's by filling in the backstory. It's essentially again trying to say it's knowable. We just don't know it. Whereas I think it kind of, for a film that was has such a heavy date of influence to Clarke's film, it seems to kind of have missed where Clarke's film was going with the sometimes there are no answers kind of message, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the problem with it is it tells us about them. We start to get an insight into their lives. We start to care about the characters, and we actually start to care about the guys who are going to perpetrate the murder. We see them kind of having their kind of homoerotic encounter in a shower and things. It's like we start deciding, okay, so this is what's going on with their lives. This is where their confusion is. They've got no girlfriends. They're not quite sure of their sexuality. They're kind of slightly depressed. They spend too much time watching these kind of movies and checking out this stuff on the internet, and we make those assumptions. And so the shooting, when it happens, whilst it still has an impact, doesn't have the impact that Clarke's film does, because it's all being contextualized in a way that Clarke's film doesn't. Conor?
Yeah, I don't 100% agree. I mean, when I was watching it, I didn't feel like the characters were particularly damaged. I mean, they all have difficulties, but I kind of felt like maybe I've just seen too many American movies about high school. The idea of bulimic girls in high school doesn't seem that normal to me. And the drunk dad and everything, it didn't really feel like they were weak or that they were in some way being set up for what happened. It just kind of felt like, oh, they have lives, and they have things in their lives that aren't brilliant, and they have problems. But I can see sort of the way I thought the film was going to be when I first saw it ages ago was shattering of innocence, basically. This kind of totally just like school and everything's fine, and then a really horrible thing happens. But rewatching it, the way that the chronology is kind of messed up makes it feel more and more like the really bad thing isn't just something that occurs at the end and that fundamentally changes the situation. It's almost like the bad thing becomes insidiously connected to everything else, just because you have these interlocking stories, and you might come up to a point in one story where one of the two shooters enters, and then cut away, and we go back sort of 20 minutes or something, and then you lead up again and again, and it feels harder to put the thing in a tighter chronology. The idea of the backstory and then looking for answers, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it feels like, from what Van Sant was kind of saying at the time of release, that he really wanted it to not be an explanation film. And there is kind of, like, they play video games and they are online looking at guns, and they have that moment in the shower, which really bothered me the first time I saw it, because I thought it was, the unhinged queer shit of the school sort of thing. But rewatching, it's actually, no, it's just because they've never been kissed, because they don't really get on with everybody else, and it's not really, it didn't feel homoerotic really at all to me. I think just their backstory felt, it didn't really feel like it was going towards an explanation that much. It felt like, oh, this could probably be really a lot of people's backstories. In some ways, because the whole issue of the film is that when Columbine happened, and the way it was told in the media, and the way that certain myths built over time, there's a fictitious mythic quality to it, you know. So I remember at the time, I knew the phrase trenchcoat mafia. I didn't really know much of why it was a phrase, but I knew it. And a lot of work's been done since Columbine to unpack that and say, look, it's not these losers who were picked on by the jocks and then shot out of revenge. You know, the shooting was almost incidental. You know, they had these massive propane bombs that they were going to explode in the cafeteria and kill hundreds, and the guns were there so they could just pick up people escaping. And the film, I like that the film does kind of have that, you know, the bombs don't go off, and the shooting feels like an afterthought almost. They're looking at their watches, they're like, well, I guess now we'll shoot a bit of people.
Plan B.
Plan B, yeah. And when they meet up kind of at the end, there isn't a sense of victory, or like, oh, they don't feel rushed by what they've done. You know, one of them just says, oh, I got the principal and got a couple of other, and then the other one shoots them. So it's a bit kind of complicated there. I like the idea of treating Columbine in a way that is trying to just show the thing itself and not have the urge to explain, mostly because the urge to explain when it comes to Columbine was so obviously a misguided thing, and ended up being a just standard conservative kind of moral panic about the state of teens today. And I like that it feels to me that the film isn't that interested in kind of coming up with motivations, etc., that it's more about showing the thing itself. But I do sort of know what you guys are saying.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that because we know that it was a response to Columbine, that's what you then... It's the same problem we have with Alan Clarke's Elephant, is that you suddenly have an event that we think we know, not least because of Michael Moore's documentary, Bowling for Columbine. You know, we think we know that story, so they make assumptions about them, we make assumptions about those characters, so even though it's not Columbine, it is Columbine. What he borrows from Clarke is the sort of the long steady cam shots. He borrows the title, and then he doesn't really borrow it with the violence at the end. The violence is shot, I don't know, it feels to me it's slightly more conventional. I feel that Van Sant is slightly more conventional than Clarke was.
I think he wants to borrow the presentation of violence from Clarke. I don't think he does it successfully. No. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I think it is that sense of, you know, the elephant in the room, the ubiquity, the sort of the invisibility of violence around us that everybody's trying desperately to ignore until it can't be ignored anymore, is for me sort of the key take. But yes, also that kind of visual presentation. I don't know, I think for me it's more about him it feels like it wants to present violence as you know, the roots of violence as being kind of unknowable, like I said before, while still desperately trying to for me what it's more about is rejecting the media narrative of the causes of school shootings, and trying to sort of say, well, okay, obviously it's more complicated than that, but still at you know, when you get down to the level, I mean, this is the problem of narrativizing it. The bleakness, the starkness of Clarke's Elephant is obviously, as we've said, that complete lack of narrativization to it. But you know, when you start to look at Van Sant's Elephant, of necessity, the characters sort of fall into some very archetypal roles. So yes, you do have, you know, the sort of the okay, I hate to use this word, but that's, I mean, they're basically the school bimbos who are obsessed with their appearance and obsessed with boys and are throwing up in the toilets, and it's an archetype, it's a cipher, it's standing in for a wider sort of recognisable form that we know, and again you have the jocks, and you have the sort of the weirdos and the artsy ones, and the sort of this tiny little flicker of manic pixie dream girl sort of dances in and dances back out of frame again. I've no idea who she is or what her contribution was to anything, but yeah, I think it wants to make the same point of Clarke, but I don't think it's quite connected with what Clarke's doing in that sort of really deeper sense.
And I don't think it's intended to. I think I agree with you both. The borrowing is the title, and very much some of the cinematic style and the use of the long tracking shots as Steadicam. I think the banality of the conversations that take place during the course of the film annoy me enormously, because it's just too often that you're getting this lengthy, at least if you just have silence, you can't complain that people are talking rubbish. But there are too many conversations that I didn't enjoy in the film because it was attempting to make it normal, natural. This is what happens everywhere. This is how people respond. And it was because it was partly scripted, I suspect, and partly improvised, that it was awkward and it didn't feel natural. And I know that with it's not a natural film in the sense that we do play with time all over the place, but in a sense it was supposed to give you the school environment as it would be for any student in an American school. That's what I felt it was trying to show. And it was trying to do that also through the characters you met and the conversations that they had. And yet I still felt that what we were meeting with was a lot of awkwardness, because I didn't feel that it was tight enough. For something which had a structure, I didn't think the dialogue was tight enough. And it was really only with the two kids, the killers, where I felt a little bit more comfortable about a relationship that was going on. Two guys who were just sort of hanging out and laughing at the adults and having a sleepover and then getting up in the morning and having casual sex and killing people. So I didn't feel it was round about there. That's when I became engaged with the film. As soon as we were introduced into that domestic environment, that's when I was interested, and that I wanted to know what was going to happen with from there on in. Before then, I was annoyed.
I guess, looking back at the two films, there is, I think, some sort of commentary on violence and gun crimes, and basically both of them, really, it's just about violence, although with America's gun problems, you kind of can't help but read gun crime into everything that's done. Do you think particularly, let's go back to Alan Clarke's Elephant as a kind of wrap up, how do you feel it sits now? How do you feel its impact is now, watching it 25, 26 years later? 27 years later? Good grief, 27 years after.
I suppose that, obviously it's dated by some of the sort of the clothes and the cars and that, but of course because it isn't given any kind of specific context, it ages very, very well. There's nothing besides the visual presentation that specifically fixes that to any historical moment, and when you talk about it, it's a universal message, and that's, I suppose, what it's trying to convey, is this universal message about the brutality. There's nothing romantic or attractive or compelling about killing people. It's brutal, and it's disturbing, and it's difficult to watch, and in a way that, when cinema, when television engages with violence, that's not a presentation that we're accustomed to. We see sort of these very hyperkinetic editing angles, and especially in the 80s, actually, when you think about the kind of product that's coming out of Hollywood and would have been very, very visible at that stage, the sexiness of violence, that the kind of the high octane track that goes with it. I mean, that kind of stripping back, that silence and complete decontextualization absolutely refuses to permit any kind of sort of adrenaline surge there, apart from just being appalled by what you're seeing. So that remains incredibly relevant, and I suppose will continue to remain incredibly relevant, depressingly enough, because the message, just if anything, the presentation of violence is becoming more and more cinematic and more sort of out competing for presentation of gore, which still fails to be as disturbing as watching a man walk calmly into a factory and be shot in the head. Yeah,
it has, first of all, a kind of formal purity that means it dates incredibly well, like you said. And you're right, it's strange to watch violence in this form when you, I watch so many blockbusters and so many just kind of schlocky stuff, every week at the multiplex, and you become so accustomed to just where the tropes that are used to make sure that the violence gives you like a feeling. You talk about adrenaline, but it's so caught up in the action of the moment and of victory and release, and he's the good guy and he's got the bad guy, and it's all kind of caught up in the sensation of story, I guess, which means that Clarke's film remains necessary as a kind of corrective or as a kind of moral opposite to really kind of clear away a lot of that clutter, that narrative clutter, and show you something that is a bit more sterile and a bit more close to life.
What I find very interesting is this is an objective view that Alan is offering us in his 18 killings, and yet our response is one which is always subjective, and that's classic filmmaking, as opposed to allow the subjectivity coming from the filmmaker but putting it into the hands of the viewer. Extraordinary. At the time it was shot, we, as a group behind the camera, were really rather alarmed about what we were doing. We were living in Ulster. We were going through daily processes, family, friends, and everything else, and our very business as being broadcasters was necessarily connected to the atrocities that had taken place and would continue to do so. And there was fear, and there was a sense of, is this what this filmmaker is judging us to be? So whilst we were interpreting his film as being a film about the Troubles, he wasn't, he wasn't doing that. And as luck would have it, I happened to travel to London the night before, or the night it was broadcast. So I walked into Television Centre the following day, and going up to the drama offices on the 5th floor, all the talk was about that film that Alan Clarke had just made, and the conversation just went on for weeks. There was a lot of, obviously, quite a lot of critical noise about it at the time in the newspapers and on television as well. And when I watched it on the television that night, and whenever I was listening to other people talking about it, I began at that time to think we had made something that really was very important, and it wasn't, and what we had imposed upon it was just what the rest of the world was going to do year in, year out afterwards. And the funny thing was, Alan Clarke's archive, as you were talking about earlier on, was something that was, it's mostly televisual, so it gets seen once and it's put on a shelf. And that's why the great filmmaker, for most of the next decade and a half after his death in 1990, he was talked about occasionally but forgotten about for his works, apart from one or two. And to have the whole canon of the work available is a really important addition to anybody's library, and Elephant will be one of the ones that will be constantly remarked upon for cinephiles and filmmakers in the future, even though they might never have had the experience even up to now to have watched it.
I do find it perhaps one of it's a really beautiful, a really filmic film. I think it's arguably the most important film about the Troubles, for me anyway, because of where it positions itself in terms of a narrative, how it takes itself one step beyond and gets beyond the green and orange, which is still such an issue here. This takes it somewhere else. And even if it wasn't about the Troubles, it is about the Troubles. And if it is about the Troubles, it's not. And I love that kind of universality of it. It's a great film that needs to be seen. And again, I was so pleased the BFI are finally releasing this stuff, because there's too much television has hidden away in great filmmakers that we haven't seen enough of.
You've been listening to CinePunked Elephants with Robert J. E. Simpson, Dr. Rachael Kelly, Conor Smyth and Kevin Jackson. The sound was engineered by Ben Simpson and recorded in the Beanbag Cinema during the Belfast Film Festival. If you've enjoyed the show, do consider leaving us a review on iTunes. You can catch up on the podcast and subscribe via your favourite podcast distributor or via our website www.cinepunked.com, where you can also find out about our upcoming live events. You can also catch up with us and interact by searching for CinePunked on Twitter and Facebook, and we're CinePunked Film on Instagram. Until the next time, I've been Robert J. Simpson. Thanks for listening.